this computer. Okay. All right, now we can start. My little introduction didn't make it onto the recording, but that'll be okay. Just trying to get it so I can see everybody. Here we go. Okay. All right. So the Parsha has an interesting, an interesting story relating to Pidyon Shvuyim. And that, of course, is the story of Lot. We're told in chapter 14, we're not going to read the entire thing, but we're told that there's these 4 kings and 5 kings, and they both seem to, there's a group of 4 that seem to eventually form an alliance against the group of 5. And after years of living under their control, they go to battle against them in verse number 9. So the 4 kings go to battle against the 5. And then in verse number 11, we read, Vayikchu et kol rechush Sodom v'Amorah ve'et kol ochlam vayelechu. They took all of the possessions of Sodom v'Amorah, 2 cities that were defeated in battle, and they went. Vayikchu et Lot ve'et rechusho ben achi Avram vayelchu hu yoshev bistom. And they took Lot and all of his possessions, Avram's nephew, and they went, and Lot was dwelling in Sodom. Vayavo hapalit vayaged laAvram haivri, ushochin be'elonei mamrei aloni, achi eshkol v'achi aner v'hem ba'alei brit Avram. The palit, the messenger, came and told Avram. Avram was dwelling in Elonei Mamre, in literally the how's it translated? In the terebinths of Mamre. And right, seemingly this is reference to someone's property. He was living on someone's land, and this Mamre was the brother of Eshkol and Aner, and they had all formed a covenant with Avram. Vayishma Avram kinishba achiv, vayarek et chanichav yelidei beito shmona asar ushlosh meot v'yerdof adan. Avram hears that his brethren, his nephew, his family had been captured, and he gathers his followers with 318 men, and he chases them all the way to Dan, all the way on the coast. He comes upon the captors at night, and he attacks them, and he chases them even further. And he returns all of the property that they had taken, and he restores Lot, his brother, and his property, and the women and the rest of the people that had been taken captive. And so it's an interesting story, and in a different year, we might spend more time analyzing or trying to analyze and make sense of the political dynamics that are going on at the time, and what this story tells us about Avram and his position in this land where he's living and trying to establish himself. What his relationship with Lot is. We spoke about that previously. It's a really rich, interesting story. On the surface, it's not totally entirely clear why we have to be concerned with this story. Like, what does it add to our understanding of Avraham? That's an interesting question. I'll take a minute if anyone has any thoughts just on the story of itself.
Well, at the moment, I can't help but be struck by, I think it's a Rashi on 15, Yechalech Alehem, which is translated here as that he divided them up. Is that what you have too? Let's see, where is that? 15. It's divided. He and his servants deployed against them.
Yeah.
But actually, another translation of Chelek would be that he divided them.
Yeah.
And then the Rashi, I think it is from, in order to pursue the 4 kings, should they flee in different directions. And that just really hit a bell because, of course, with the release of the hostage, what was it, yesterday, the 85-year-old, I believe, or
Yeah.
she described this just incredible underground set of like a warren, of things down below there. So here, I mean, how many troops would it take for the IDF to go into all these different places and be safe? I mean, it really hit me over the head.
Yeah.
To see that they were divided in 4 directions, but I know that wasn't quite your question. Your question
that's okay. That's okay.
With the dynamics going on here, and obviously there are incursions from the Tigris Euphrates Valley with the representations of these people that are coming in there and causing trouble anyway. So he's off. He's trying to defend the whole place, really, in a sense. He's trying to let them know that they've got somebody to reckon with. And people recognize that, evidently, since they proclaimed him king, according to Rashi, the survivors. So,
yeah,
it may be a very small battle in the history, but it shows that if somebody acts very quickly and goes and does something, it can be a really good thing.
Right. Gwen, were you going to say something before?
I was just going to say, how come, and what was his nephew's name?
Lot.
How come Lot went with them?
So Lot was taken captive.
Oh.
So if you remember, a few months ago, we went back to this to the precursor to this story when Lot and Avram separated ways. Right, Lot chose to live in Stone because it was like Egypt. It was very lush and watered by the river as opposed to dependent on rain. So Lot was living here, right? And this seemingly is all a build-up to what we're going to read next week about Abraham negotiating on behalf of Sodom and Gomorrah when God wants to destroy them. So, right, Sodom figures very prominently, but in this story, Lot was taken captive. He didn't go with them voluntarily.
Oh, I see. Okay.
If I may just add one other thing, archaeologically, we have found some of these names in the pottery down below and so on. So the king of Adma, the king of Shvuyim, the king of Bela, and so on. These names, Bela and Soar, have actually been found in inscription. So, there's something historical going on there. Yeah. Sure.
Okay, so it's also interesting to note that Avram takes on this battle, this responsibility, right? There's an interesting Rashi. I don't know, Anne, if anyone else saw it, about this messenger that comes to tell Avram that Lot has been taken.
Yeah.
Who does Rashi say the messenger was?
Og.
It was Og Melech HaBashan, or Og the giant. And Rashi tells us that Og actually had very different intentions in informing Abraham, right? We read on the surface, it seems like he's coming, he's saying, your nephew's been taken captive, do something about it. But Rashi says that he actually was hoping that Abraham would go to battle and would be killed in battle, and that would give him permission to take Sarah as a wife. So there's a whole lot of stuff going on in this story. But it is interesting that Avram springs to action, not because there's captives, but because it's his nephew, right? That there's the strong family drive, and that's an interesting question, right? Both in terms of in situations of hostages, is who has the responsibility? Is it a responsibility on the family, or right? If Lot had not been taken captive, would Avraham also have gone to just free anyone that's being held captive? That's one interesting question. So there's just a lot. There's a lot to unpack in this story, but we're gonna quickly move away from the story. It's really just our to give us some grounding and basis in the parsha.
Actually, I have a question too.
Yeah, please.
Do we? I've always found it somewhat surprising that Abraham gets this little army together and goes to rescue Lot.
Yeah.
I find it unexpected that he commands a military force of some kind. And should that just be self-understood because of the time and place where he lives, that a group like his would be able to defend itself if necessary?
I think it is of note. I don't know. We're told when at the very beginning of the parsha, when Avraham hears the message from God and he goes to Eretz Canaan, it takes the Tanefesh Asher Asu B'Charan. Right. So whether we take the interpretation that these were converts or people that were following in Avraham's mission, we know he had a camp. We know he had a following, and presumably that only grew. Who these people are, I don't know. They must, and right. We're told also that he had a covenant with Mamre and his brothers. So Avraham, part of what's going on here is Avraham's emergence, not only as a significant religious figure in the land, but as a political force as well. Right, and that probably is all leading up to his purchase of the land to bury Sarah, to have his own legal holding in this territory. So it's interesting that he has an army, and right, we don't think of Avraham as a general, as one of his many job descriptions and strengths. But who exactly they are, or what the relationship or what the arrangement was, is another interesting question. And in a different year, maybe we can explore that. But it's a good question, Beatrice.
May I give one tiny answer?
Yep.
Because he was working with people who were his students or somehow closely related to him, in a sense, the existence of the Holy One who he's trying to explain to them is at stake in a way here, because all these others think in terms of winning battles because they're idolatrous, their attempts at transcendence are the ones who are doing, and Abram knows at this point that the Holy One wants him to have the land and have that land. So it's almost a point of saying, well, this one wants him to have land, then I should have to be able to fight for the land, and I'm going to fight in some way. He didn't want these people from the Tigris-Euphrates Valley to just roll over them yet. They will come and roll over us later, but not now. Thank you very much.
Right, and that seems to be the continuation of the story. I didn't read the entire chapter, but right, in his interaction with Melchizedek and with the king of Stone, they want to pay him. He refuses, right, and that's certainly part that that seems to be that he wants to drive home the message that his success comes only from Hashem and not from anyone else. So yeah, that's definitely going on here.
There's also, if I can add, I came in late, but there's also the idea of hishtadlus, as they say,
right?
Hishtadlut. It's not enough to have perfect faith that the Ribono Shel Olam will intervene and so on. You have to take the steps necessary towards the goal, and hopefully with blessings and so on, it'll work out as best as possible.
Yeah.
And Avram's ready to do what needs to be done with his 318 or 19 chanichim and so on.
Right. Okay. So this is really good. Let's switch our focus and get to some more classical halachic sources in this regard. So perhaps we're familiar with the statement in the Gemara in Bava Basra number 2. Pidyon Shvuyim mitzvah rabahi. Redeeming captives is a great mitzvah. And then they say, how do we know this? It quotes a pasuk. The pasuk says, Vayaki omru elecha ana neitzev, amarta aleichem komar Hashem, asher lamavet lamavet, asher lacherev lacherev, asher larav larav, asher lashevi lashevi. It shall come to pass when they say to you, to where shall we depart? Then you shall say to them, so says the Lord, such as for death to death, and such as for sword to sword, and such are for famine to famine, and such as for captivity to captivity. From Yirmiyahu, and Rabbi Yochanan tells us, Kol ha'me'uchar b'pasuk zeh kashem echavero. Whatever comes later in the in this pasuk is more difficult, more severe than what comes earlier. So since captivity comes last in this order of horrible things that could happen, the assumption being made is that captivity is the worst, and therefore freeing someone from captivity is a great mitzvah. The Rambam tells us, following along in this line of thinking, Pidyon Shvuyim kodem leparnasat aniyim lechisotan. Pidyon Shvuyim is such a great mitzvah that it comes before providing for the poor. Ve'en lecha mitzvah gedola kepidyon shvuyim shashavui harehu bichlal hareivim hatzmeim harumim omeid b'sakanat nefashot. There's no greater mitzvah than pidyon shvuyim, because someone being held in captive is also hungry and thirsty and lacking clothing and is in danger of their life. So if you could save a captive, you're really taking care of all these other types of people as well. And anyone who turns their eyes away from redeeming a captive violates all sorts of psukim. Don't stand by the blood of your brother. Don't be obstinate. Don't be cruel, etc., etc. And then he concludes this halacha, Ein lecha mitzvah rabbah kepidyon shvuyim. There is no mitzvah greater than pidyon shvuyim. Okay, so this is really a very important mitzvah. And the Shulchan Aruch says, gives a similar introduction in source number 4. I mean, again, just in the interest of time, we're not going to look at the entire thing, but you can see that this gets not only as a nice idea or something, but this actually gets codified in halacha, how important Pidyon Shvuyim is. That being said, yeah.
Excuse me, but I really feel compelled to ask, right up above the Shulchan Aruch section 4, there's another part to the Rambam, and that really rings true with what's going on right now.
So let's look at the Talmudic source that's based on, and we can come back to it if we need to. Okay. So that's from source number 5. Ein podin et hashvuyin yater al kedei demehen mipnei tikun ha'olam. We cannot, the Mishnah tells us, captives are not redeemed for more than their actual monetary value. And the reason given is tikkun olam. Quite interesting. We hear the phrase tikkun olam, and we think of social justice. But this is actually the original context of tikkun olam. That we can't give too much ransom for redeeming captives because of tikkun olam. So what does tikkun olam mean?
Means the setting straight of the world, in a sense. The
redeeming,
complete healing of the world. There are lots of ways that shorish can go.
It's to prevent inflation of ransoms.
Okay. So I agree, Anne, that there is something that fixes the world if we redeem captives, but the Gemara certainly it takes it the way Robert is reading it. Let's skip down to the Gemara. In the English, it's in all caps. It says Gemara about 4 or 5 lines down. Ibayalahu. So the question was posed. Hai mipnei tikkun ha'olam. What is meant by the phrase tikkun ha'olam? Mishum duchka desiborahu, Odioma mishum delo ligavru v'laitu tfei. Is it because of not wanting to put undue pressure on the community? Robert, I think what you phrased it as inflation, right? Not wanting to overburden the financial resources of the community in paying ransom for hostages? Or is it in order to discourage the taking of more captives? That's the two ways the Gemara understands it.
There's the model possibly of the custom of burying the dead in a plain white shroud, because people had at one point in the time
Right.
of Rabban Gamliel, I guess, spend vast fortunes on elaborate funerals, to the point where people who were poor were abandoning the bodies out in publics, leaving it to so they be treated like meis mitzvah,
Right.
and buried minimally.
Right.
And that's disgraceful to the respect that any mace should receive from their own family and friends. And the family and friends should not be put into such a circumstance. So it's kind of a price control or a demand control.
Yeah. So it's that's a very important insight, but we have to read on in the Gemara. So we have these two possible reading understandings of the ruling of the Mishnah, right? You can't spend too much, either because we don't want to overly burden the community, or because we don't want to encourage or create a situation where even more captives will be taken. Let's put on our Gemara caps. What would be a practical difference? What would be the nafkamina between these two explanations? Any thoughts?
Well, I was just thinking that tikkun olam in this case means the well-being of the community. Is that
Okay.
the point?
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's the question. What if, as is the case of our parsha, right, that the responsibility or the task of redeeming is not being taken on by the community, but is being taken on by the family? Are there any limits? What would the limits be in that situation? So if the reason is because we don't want to overly burden the community financially, if a family is going to take on the financial burden, then there shouldn't be any limits. They should be able to pay whatever they want to pay, whatever they're able to pay. But if it's because we don't want to encourage the taking of more captives, then even a rich family shouldn't be able to overly pay. Right? There's a whole other question about how do we know what paying too much is. So that gets, that's a question both in Gemara times when we're talking about, like, in our times as well, right? If a price tag, if a price or a demand is given, how are we to determine what's excessive and what's not excessive? We think that every human life is of infinite value.
We also should consider the neighbors of the people, that are spending the money, or for the dead, because if they make a big, huge, expensive monument, then their neighbors can't do that and feel inferior.
Right. So that's true, but so that means that their mother should remain in captivity, right? It goes both ways. So the Gemara wants to try to prove that it goes one way based on the following. Tashma de Levi bar Darga parka levarte betlesar alpe dinari zahav. We know that there was a case that Levi bar Darga redeemed his son who had been taken captive with an exuberant amount of money, with 12,000 gold coins. So that would seem to indicate that it's a concern of the finances, right? And if this individual is willing to pay for his son whatever he can pay, then that should be okay.
Because
But
his
then the
daughter-
Gemara says, no, this isn't really good proof. Amar Abaye, Uman Leimalan Viraton Chachamim Avad. How do we know that he was acting in agreement with the sages? Maybe he went against halachic advice by paying such a huge sum for his son. So we, at the end of the day, we don't know. The Gemara is not able to prove which the real motivating factor is. Okay, so to further complicate the matter, let's go to source number 7. So we know that on the one hand, it's a great mitzvah. We have to do whatever we can. We can't delay. We have, right? It's a really important thing, but there is a limit that we can't pay too much. And right, the related question, certainly in our day and age, is I don't think anyone would claim that paying too much is only translated into dollar signs, right? But what about release, prisoner exchange? Is that paying too much? A lot of the terrorists that were freed in the Gilad Shalit exchange were the ones who perpetuated the atrocities on October 7th. So right, that certainly is a great price to pay. Right. What about the cost of a war, the cost of lost lives? All go into this consideration. In source number 7, we have another story of someone taken captive. Tanu Rabbanan, Maaseh Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya, shehalach lichrach gadol shebaromi. There's this Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya who goes to a great big city in Rome. Armulo, Tinok echad yesh beveit asurim yefei naim v'tov ro'yu kvutotav sturot lo taltalim halach ve'amad al petach beit asurim. So they tell him that there's this, this Jewish boy, beautiful Jewish child, was taken captive and is now in jail. So Rabbi Yeshua ben Chananya goes to the jail and he begins reciting a pasuk from Yeshayahu. Amar minatan lemeshisa Yaakov Yisrael levozazim. The pasuk begins, who gave Jacob and stood by the for spoil and Israel to the robbers. And this child who's being held in jail hears the rabbi saying the verse, and he gives the conclusion of the verse. Halo Hashem zu chatanu lo velo avu bidrachav halo chol shamu b'torato. He says, the pasuk continues, it's Hashem, and we have sinned to him, and we didn't follow his ways. We did not listen to the Torah. So this rabbi who hears the boy answer or give the conclusion of the pasuk says, Muftechani bo shemorer hora Israel. I can see that this boy is going to grow up to be a great teacher of Torah in the Jewish people. Says, I swear I'm not going to leave until I redeem him with whatever money they're demanding. And that's in fact what happens. He gives a huge sum of money in order to free this child. Umanu Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha. And in short time, this child did in fact grow up to be a great teacher of Torah. It was in fact Rabbi Yishmael ben Elisha, whom we read about, was a Kohen Gadol, right, was one of the great mystics, a really significant figure. So we have a question. What's the question?
Spending a huge amount of money.
Yeah, how could he spend a huge amount of money to redeem one captive? We just saw the Gemara in Bava Batra that says we don't do that. Any suggestions?
Some people are worth more than others.
Some people are worth more than others. That's in fact the first answer that the Tosfot gives. Tosfot asked the question in number 8, Rabbi Yoshua ben Chanina de Parke lahu tinok b'mamon harbe b'hanazikin, right? He quotes our story. Lefi shahaya muflag b'chachma, because he was outstanding in his wisdom and his knowledge. Muflag bechachma. His knowledge was outstanding, and therefore, as Robert says, he was worth more. And we can break the rule about not overspending if someone meets this criteria of muflag bechachma. That's the first answer Tosfot gives. Second answer he gives, inami b'shat chorban habayit lo shtayach shelo ligberu. Says the time period when this story takes place was during the time when the Beit HaMikdash had been destroyed. Jews were being taken captive all the time. So therefore, there was no concern that ransoming one would lead to taking of others captive, because there were so many Jews being taken captive. And the final answer Tosfot gives in a separate source, number 9, is that if the person's life is in danger, then we can spend more, or we're obligated to spend more, because we have to do everything we can to save a life. If we know they're being held in jail, but they're being given 3 meals a day, they have visitation rights, so maybe that's, their life is not in immediate danger. But if they're being held in squalid conditions, then it's a different litmus test. So we have these two contradicting sources, and again, trying to apply it to different situations is both intellectually fun and also very, very difficult to do. So how would you make a determination in a situation like Israel's facing today? Right? And certainly everyone would agree that these people are in grave danger. Right? No one thinks that Hamas is treating them well. So maybe that should mean that we have to do everything in our capacity. But on the other hand, there's the policy concern that maybe if we give in to the demands, it'll just lead to more Jews being taken captive and emboldening Hamas. It's very difficult decisions to make. One more Gemara source. Actually, let's do the Gemara sources, then we'll see how much time we have to go into anything more. So we'll go down to number 11, and this is talking about a case where a woman is taken captive. So the question is, what in the case of a woman taking a married woman, what are the husband's responsibilities? Is that a different calculation? Tanu Rabbanan nishpeit vayimuvakshim mimenu ad asara b'dameha pam rishona poda bikan va'elach rotze poda rotza eno poda. So if a wife is taken captive and they ask up to 10 times her value, and again, what her value is an interesting question we're going to put aside for now, but up to 10 times that they're asking, the first time he should redeem her. If they take her captive again, this guy's willing to pay. This man must really love his wife. So after he's paid once an exuberant price, then it's up to him. If he wants to, he's allowed to pay again, but he's not obligated to. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel Omer in Podina Tashrayin Yoter Al Kadei Demehem. He quotes the Gemara that we saw, that we're not allowed to redeem captives for more than they are worth. Mipnei Tikkun Olam, because of Tikkun Olam, we can't be concerned just with the husband to his wife. We have to think about a more universal implications of what ransoming might do in that situation. Ha bichdei demehen podin afagav de pirkuna yoter al ktubata. Then there's a second consideration. Right, so we're not allowed to pay over their value, but we're certainly allowed to and perhaps obligated to pay up to their value. So then the question is, do we limit the amount a husband has to pay for his wife to what the going value is, or what the value of her ketubah is? Right? Is there a further limitation by the ketubah that a husband, even if we could say that, right, the ketubah is 400 zuz, this woman is certainly worth 1,000 zuz, but so that gets into this point. That's the point of this source. And so just something else to keep in mind. And then one more Talmudic source comes from the Yerushalmi in number 14. It's kind of buried on the source sheet. Rabbi Isid Itztayed Besif Sufsa. Rabbi Itztayed was taken captive in the city Safsufa. Amar Yochanan Yikarech Hamet Besid Sadino. Rabbi Yochanan says, up, he's already a dead man walking. Right? We can't redeem him. We can't free him. There's nothing we could do. We might as well take out the burial shards now. Amar B'Shimon ben Lakish ad de ana katil va'ana mitkil ana ezil mesheziv lebechela. B'Shimon ben Lakish, Reish Lakish says, even if I should kill or be killed, I shall go and save him. Azal ufaiso v'yavenon le. So Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish goes, and he winds up negotiating and freeing Rabbi Isi. And that's the final source. So this raises another interesting question, which is certainly one that's very relevant in the current situation, which is the question of endangering oneself in order to redeem a captive, or endangering others. Right? Avram went to war. Avram, as we said, wasn't known as a warrior, wasn't known as a general. And he brought his army with him, or his chanicha, whoever they were, Beatrice. Right? Was he, even if he was justified or allowed to pay a ransom for Lot, was he justified halachically to go into battle to save him? So, Reish Lakish seems to imply, yes, that he would be allowed to, that you can endanger yourself in order to free someone. Although, interestingly, even though Reish Lakish is prepared to go to battle, how does he ultimately free Rabbi Isi?
By negotiating.
By negotiating. So he doesn't actually. We don't know if he at any point was in danger, or if he went in and only negotiated. So that's another obviously very relative source to this entire situation. Quite interestingly, in source number 16, we have the Beit Yosef. The Beit Yosef is Rav Yosef Karo's commentary on the Torah, kind of like his footnotes. And from the Beit Yosef, he condensed it even further, and that's the Shulchan Aruch. So in the Beit Yosef, Rav Yosef Karo says that one is allowed to endanger themselves in order to free a captive. Right. V'katva got my maniot, source number 16. Avar alo tamoda v'chule. Right. If you don't do what you're able to do to free a captive, then you have transgressed the prohibition against don't stand idly by the blood of your brother. V'yushtami meisik afilu lahachnis atzmo b'safek sakana chayav. And the Yerushalmi says that even to enter into a situation where you're potentially in danger, you're obligated to do so. Nira hatam mipnei shahala vadai v'hu safek. Right. So the reason is because the person being held captive is certainly endangered. If you're going to try to rescue them, you're only potentially in danger. You're not necessarily threatened, and so therefore you're obligated. In the Shulchan Aruch, though, he doesn't include this. He doesn't include that you're obligated or you should put yourself in danger. And so most, like the Sma in number 18, assume the reason he doesn't include it in the Shulchan Aruch is that ultimately he rules that most Rishonim don't assume that one must risk his life to save others from danger. So that certainly has policy implications for what's going on with the current situation. And clearly the war that Israel is fighting is about more than the hostages, but that's a very significant factor in it, right? So both is the fact that hostages were taken justification for the army to go to war and to put troops in danger, and is is not so clear. It's not so cut and dry, just from the perspective of Pidyon Shvuyim. Two interesting cases from history that further complicates or inform the discussion. The first is one that I know we've mentioned before, but it's a really important source, which is the Maharam of Rothenburg. We go back to source number 10, we just have an allusion to it, but the Maharam was taken captive and was held for 7 years, I believe. And he was the leading rabbi of his generation, the leading rabbi of all of world Jewry, was held in captive for 7 years. Okay, so first of all, it's not clear, right? He clearly wasn't in danger. They held him for a long time. He wrote Sfarim while he was in jail. He wasn't, it wasn't a situation where he was being held in tunnels in Gaza. But nonetheless, his students gathered together and they were prepared to pay whatever ransom was being asked. This is our rabbi. This is the leading teacher of Torah for the Jewish people. And they have a justification. What's the justification to ransom the Maharam?
He's muflag b'Torah. Is that what the phrase
Muflag
was?
b'chachma, muflag b'Torah. He certainly was someone that was stood out for his Torah knowledge and his wisdom. Right, as we said, this is someone who's worth paying more for. We know he was valuable, and the Maharam refused to would not let them ransom him. And so there's different explanations for why that would be the case, right? Even if the Maharam was modest, right, he had to recognize that he was a leading Torah figure. So most explain that he was concerned that if he would be set free, then they would just take another rabbi in his place. And so he didn't think it was justifiable to free himself in order for another leading teacher or scholar to be taken, right? Others explained it as it was a concern of the running out, the over abuse of the community resources. That even for a muflag b'chachma, there had to be a limit, that the community can't impoverish itself in order to free even a leading rabbi. And the second,
doesn't he have priority in the decision, though?
Say again?
If he's the Gadol Ador,
Yeah.
and he is but is he not permitted to rule for himself?
Oh, so that's an interesting question. I mean, he did, because they didn't ransom him. They listened to him. Right. So that's an interesting question. Would he be considered too nogea b'davar to issue a halachic ruling? That's an interesting question. I don't know. The second case from history is Rav Yitzchak Hutner, who was a leading figure in the 1970s, 1980s. Rosh Yeshiva of Chaim Berlin. I quote from his Sefer, the Pachad Yitzchak, often. He was taken hijack. He was on a plane that was taken hijack in 1970. Hijacked by Palestinian terrorists and forced to land in Jordan. So a group of leading rabbis got together and they wanted to pay ransom to free Rav Hutner. Even as others were being held captive from the same flight, they thought to ransom Rav Hutner. He met the criteria that they should do it. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky, another leading rabbi from America of the time, voiced his opinion that under these circumstances, the heter, the permission to spend over and above the acceptable rate, even for a Torah teacher, cannot be used. He argued that the hijacking was considered halachically an act of war, falling under the halachic definition of milchemet mitzvah, a war which one has a mitzvah to fight in. Rav Hershel Schachter, who teaches at Yeshiva University today, recalls the events, as well as the opinion of Yaakov Kamenetsky, and he says as follows: although generally in the case of Pidyon Shvuyim, The Jewish community is forbidden to ransom a captive for an exorbitant sum. The ruling in the case of a great scholar is that he should be ransomed even for a sum that exceeds his worth. Thus, many rabbis were of the opinion that every effort should be made to secure Rav Hutner's release. Rav Yaakov Kamenetsky dissented, however, arguing that the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuyim only applies in peacetime, but surely not during hostilities, when the delivery of ransom money to the enemy would strengthen their position. He continued to explain that although a ceasefire existed at the time, the 1948 War of Independence had never really ended. And so, right, we're still in a state of battle against the Arab nations, even if there's not officially war declared at the moment. Later that year, in September of 1970, Rav Moshe Feinstein released a halachic statement directed to the government of Israel, demanding that its leaders comply with the demands of the terrorists. An urgent meeting of the Rabbinic Council held a solemn discussion about the dangerous state of the captives in Jordan and the difficulty of the state of Israel to reach a decision on the matter. We saw fit to express our opinion. The opinion of Torah and Jewish law, saving a life takes precedence. If there's no choice, the state of Israel must comply with the terrorist demand to save the hostages' lives. So, interestingly, is Rav Moshe Feinstein was addressing all of the captives and not just Rav Hutner. So that's a really important distinction to make between these two stages of the story. Ultimately, the hostages were released, but it gives another case studies by which to try to make sense of what possibly to do in this situation. Right. The other famous example from Israeli history, well, there's many examples, unfortunately, but the rescue mission in Entebbe, right? Was that a justified act? It certainly was an amazing act, and it's considered to have been successful. But there were lives lost. There were Jewish lives lost. And was it halachically justifiable to endanger those soldiers that went on the mission? There have unfortunately been many botched attempts to free captives that didn't go as well. And the most immediate recent case is, of course, that of Gilad Shalit, where when he was returned, there was huge celebrations across the world. But there were also many who said this was too high a price to pay. And as desperately as we wanted to bring him home, and unfortunately those counter arguments seem to have what to base themselves on in the recent events. So it's a very complicated situation. We're not going to come to, we're certainly not going to be the ones to make the difficult decisions that have to be made. Right, that the whole other piece of it is, and again, it's a factor that's familiar to us, and I wonder how it would fit into these halachic paradigms. It's about the morale of the country, right? So part of the justification in the Gilad Shalit deal, at least, was that if you are going to require every citizen to serve in the army, then perhaps you have a greater responsibility to ensure their safe return, if God forbid anything happens. And so, right, that's a whole other policy discussion, but that might play in. If part of the reason why we don't spend too much is because of the policy concern that more will be taken captive or will tap the resources. So perhaps that has to be weighed against, how are you going to ensure that there will be a strong and competent army, might be because you're willing to go to even greater extremes than would be required by the strict law in order to ensure their safety and do everything you can to bring it captives home. It's not at all an easy sugya. It's not at all an easy question. And again, I don't think I have any more answers, but hopefully going through some of this material will help us to think through some of the issues and some of the concerns and appreciate the complexity of it. And as I said at the beginning, that our learning together should be for merit, as a chut, for the speedy return of all those being held captive, in whatever way that happens. Certainly, we celebrate those that have been returned and pray that there'll be many more. Are there any final questions or thoughts on any of this?
I have just a quick thought, which
Yeah.
is, I'm just, I don't think, I suppose I shouldn't be surprised, but I'm kind of amazed by all of those questions which feel so relevant right now are all there in our traditional sources. It's questions I don't think about every day, and it's not the part of the sources that we go to all the time.
Right.
But there they all are, and
Well,
which
unfortunately, it's been a relevant topic for much of Jewish history.
yeah,
But applying those principles to our day and age is, I think there is great comfort in seeing and that the issues have been discussed, but how to apply it is a whole different can of worms.
yeah. So thank you.
All right, thank you. Okay, we should hear good news soon, and everyone should have a good night, a good week, and I'll hopefully see you in Shul on Shabbos.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Okay.
Rabbi.
Thank you.
Take care,
Very
everyone.
interesting.